Hey, good morning. Welcome to Watershed. We're so glad you're here. Would you stand and let's sing together this morning? Ring the bells this time of me. Feel the hate you fairly well. Get back pieces of my Jesus. Make your counterfeit to hell. Bang the drums, this means war. Not the kind you're waiting for. We say mercy won't be rational. That's what we're fighting for.
Love is here and loving more than what the hell is loving even for? We can sing it loud enough, we'll keep on adding voices up.
Ring the bell, ring the bell, ring the shoes and your steeples. Does that get too close to home? I got faith on the mountain and to watch that mountain move. It's time for words.
When I send the more to sing, love me through the cavalry.
Ring the bell, 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 ring the bell. Call me boy instead of son, and I ain't the only one who's in the throne room of a kingdom that found that I belong. I ain't scared of those supports, I've seen them fall before. With broken bones you built it, but it crumbles four by four.
Yeah, love me more than what the hell is loving even for? We can sing it loud enough, we'll keep on adding voices up.
Ring the bell, ring the bell, ring the bell, ring the bell, ring the bell. Some need with the hatred fairly well. Get back the pieces of my Jesus. Take your counterfeits in. Thank you so much for name some of the parts of our Christian heritage, our Christian roots, and so this morning, part of what that means is we would like you to take a second and be present to what you're feeling this morning. So when we walk into this space, we walk into a room and we're together and we're around lots of different people, and there are probably different ideas and beliefs about who God is, what God is, where God is. Part of what makes this space unique is our ability to sit with all of that and say that it's good. So whoever you are and whatever you believe, we're glad that you're here, and we want to make room for all of who you are. So thank you so much for being here. If you're new, we want to welcome you into this room, into this space, and we want to let you know a few ways that you can kind of find out more about what's happening here at Watershed. You can connect with us on social media. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, any of those. We'd love to connect with you there. You can go to our website, watershedcharlotte.com, or you can download our app. Those are all great ways to kind of find out more about what's happening here at Watershed. Before we continue, let's take a few minutes and greet the people around you, and then we'll continue singing together. Exploring this idea of reclamation. What do we bring with us when it comes to our faith, our Christian heritage, our Christian narrative? And so this morning I wanted to sing a song that was old. And so got a song, and we looked it up right before service. It was written in 1899. I really wanted to find something that was written in the 1800s, and so it barely made the cutoff. This song was written then, and I want to ask Seth to bring up the third verse of this song. There's this line, the hours hastening on when we shall be forever with the Lord. And there's this idea in Christianity of this escapist mentality, this escapist theology that kind of says that the goal, the prize, what we're doing here is to get somewhere else, is to get to heaven, to do something that leads us to a place where the reward is down the road. And so when I was a kid, I heard this and I was like, well, sweet, I don't have to worry about littering, right? And it was like this kind of mentality, like, who cares? Like, the world's going to burn up and it doesn't matter. And so it could be something that small, that kind of thinking could lead to something that small, or it could lead to this space where we aren't able to be present. Write this phrase, be still. Be present. Be here. And if you're anything like me, and on March 1st in 2020, that message still matters. So while we may not, we can still cling to this idea that being present matters. So we're going to sing this song together, and interspersed in the song, I'm going to sing this phrase, be still my soul. And as I do that, whatever way in which you need to still your soul, I want you to feel the freedom to take that posture. Maybe it's eyes closed, maybe it's seated, maybe it's hands open, hands on your heart, whatever it is. I want to invite you into these moments together.
Be still, my soul. The Lord is on your side. Bear patiently the cross of grief or pain. Leave to He will remain.
Be still. Be still, my soul. Be still, my soul. Be still, my soul.
Be still, my soul. Your God will undertake to guide the future as in ages
Be still, my soul. Still, my soul. My soul. Be still, my soul. Be still, my soul. Be still, my soul. Be still, my soul. God, this morning as we still our hearts and we slow down. God, may the breath that we take remind us of our presence here. May we be reminded that we are rooted into something deep that has connected and affected people for thousands of years. In all of its goodness and ugliness and pain and joy. And we come together here this morning and we are showing up because we want to believe that there is unconditional love and a goodness that exists, that is bigger than us, that envelops us, that is the thing that we breathe in and breathe out. And it binds us together. And so we show up, God. Thank you. We love you. We pray that this morning is enveloped in your love. Your name.
And prefaces this. I call it a low hurdle in terms of your time initially, but once you're in it, to see the folks and the stories and to hear how many of you are moving in your faith journey, and some of you are saying, I'm really excited about what's going on in terms of being here at Watershed. It's just been really exciting to be able to watch many of you make some of the shifts that we're going to even talk about here in the next few moments this morning. So preface, something we do 5 times a year. We've got our preface 3 starting here in about 4 weeks. If you're interested, please sign up to be a part of that. It's a kind of a kicking the tire experience that we really enjoy getting to, and frankly, selfishly, we get to enjoy meeting you guys and being a part of that journey with you. So love to be a part of that. Also, blocks is something that we have here that are really showing up here on a Sunday and maybe rubbing shoulders and elbows with that same person in a context like this, where you get to hear sort of the larger narrative that is Watershed, and then you get to be in the trenches in people's lives, people's homes. And so we highly recommend the whole block experience. If you haven't been a part of that, if you're not in one, you're missing out here, because what makes Watershed so beautiful are our people. And when you get to know somebody in a close way, it just adds to the experience. We have these experiences here also called our justice initiatives, and one of them is with Heart Math Tutoring, where we get to come alongside some of the kids in our school system that might struggle in the math space, and we get to just be present with them. And even if you're not really good at math, you'll be okay in this context because the math is not that complicated, bottom line. All that to say, if you're interested and you say, you know what, I got a few moments in a week, I think I could take investing in a student seriously, at least maybe for a semester or 2. If that's something you're interested in doing, we'd love to have you think about signing up and being a part of that. Everything I'm talking about is on our Watershed app in the Sunday morning announcement section. Also next week, we're going to have the Heart Math Tutor person come here and be sharing a little bit with us in terms of what we've been doing with them this past year and what we can plan on doing next year. So we'd love to be a part of that with us. I also was talking with Blair in the hallway. Blair, you might have 4 and 5-year-olds, that we need to have a second 4 and 5-year-old class looking to start. So all that to say, she said, let people know that I am going to be reaching out to some of you and inviting them into being a part of the Greenhouse experience. And so What a great time to jump in. Blair's a new pastor. She's amazing to work alongside. I enjoyed that thoroughly. And so just want to kind of give you a heads up on that space. I was talking before the service and with one of you, and you started sharing with me what your journey has been kind of in life a little bit, and then in particular here at Watershed. You started talking about the nuances that you've found in terms of faith and Christ and God and what you do with all of it and where you were and where you are now. And that's not a pat on our back thinking we're all that. And I say it with all due humility, there is no other place in Charlotte and in the region that I would argue that is doing the kind of work that we get to do in sort of holding the tension of what it means to struggle and to wake up in terms of your faith journey. And so for those of you who are part of this, thank you. For those of you who are serving here, thank you. For those of you who invest resources so we continue to do the kind of work we get to do, thank you so much, and want to continue. You can go to Watershed app, metal boxes in the back, all that kind of mess. If you have any questions related to any of it, please don't hesitate to let us know. I want to thank you for being with us this morning. I'm excited about the moments ahead this morning and look forward to sharing more.
I was on my knees again, begging for my way to please you. It's gone away. Your temptress, your blame, for the guilt I can't displace. Though there's winters and summers, so much has changed. You're the fortress for my shame. I was born in the shadows, preachers and saints. I was raised in the house of God, but the blood on my lips and the dirt on my face is all the religion I got. It's all the religion I've got. Whoa. I was lost inside your arms, trying to climb my way back out, but it ain't what you got or the buildings you bought save you from the sound. She's a Harlem wind, built by greed and selfish men. Though it's easy to love her, for all you discover, she's bound to fall again. I was born in the shadows, preachers and saints. I was raised in the house of God, but the blood on my lips and the dirt on my face is all the religion I got. It's all the religion I got. I was born in the shadows, preachers and saints. I was raised in the house of God, but the blood on my lips and the dirt on my face is all the religion I've got. It's all the religion I've got.
So what I want to do in this series, or what I want to do in particular today, is to work really hard to make this deeply personal for you. So this series is sort of attempting to articulate what arguably the larger narrative of the church is. Maybe we could talk a little about how we've gotten it wrong, or how we should do it differently, or what it should begin to look like. And that's okay, and that's important, that's helpful. And I think Matt last week did a really nice job of sort of parsing our mission here at Watershed, of which, frankly, it's taken us 15 years to get to this place. We've had different statements that have defined us over the years, but none of them that we have felt as passionate about and has kind of come from the visceral interior that is this community. And so Matt talked about it last week, and I just want to quickly kind of wash over it, that Watershed is a community awakening, struggling, and loving together as though a different world is possible today. That we are waking up to so many things that we are so uninformed on. In humility, we are coming into a new understanding on so many different fronts, in so many areas, and so many nuances, relationships, and how we understand people developing their spiritual expression, and how we interpret the scriptures, and how we understand sexuality, and how we understand all these different nuances that have been really powerful us to come to the place that is now Watershed. And then, of course, we do it all through struggle. None of this has happened without struggle and pain. That's life, right? That's just the beauty and the angst of life, is that pain informs so much of how we see reality. And so the community awakening, struggling, and of course, if we can't love well together, then we're missing the whole thing. And so what does it mean for that? Someday, not down the road, but today. That it's in the immediate. That it's with a sense of urgency. It's with a sense of let's move on this, and let's bring change as quickly as possible. So I just had my 50th birthday, and I got a letter from AARP already, and a lot of changes. I've had so many changes and so many experiences, some of them good and some of them painful. Almost 19 years of marriage, and every year is a different growing experience between my wife and I. Pastoring this church for 15 years and full-time 31 years, and this assumption of how I saw reality just a few decades ago, even a few years ago, and how we see it now is so different. It's changed so much. And that's the beauty, I think, of what we get to do here. We assume change. And so we look at this mission that is ours, that I just read to you. And what we began to do is, as we were kind of distilling this statement and coming to bring it into reality, this took us months to work on. And what happened was there began to be these sort of legs that supported it, these ideas that inform it, these concepts that are really important to its success. And we're calling them pathways. And so what I want to be able to do this morning is maybe introduce just one of those pathways. And maybe it's informed by this story. This week I was talking with somebody, and they were sharing with me how they are missing their previous spiritual space. They're missing that they're not where they were, and they've changed, they've deconstructed. That's language some people like to use. They've sort of evolved, for lack of a better term, but they simultaneously are not regretting, they're just missing what was. And arguably it was a naivete, right? It was a cluelessness. And sometimes being in that space is actually really nice, and it's a privileged space, but nonetheless, it's nice to be in that naivete, in that naive space. But what I'm finding is happening here is that Watershed's been an experiment for 15 years. And we truly, truly, in the truest sense, have no idea what we're doing. I mean that in a real way. And then yet simultaneously, I think we're waking up to some things. And if I could take your lives, and if I could somehow bring them together and make a bunch of generalizations, I think there's some steps, some stages we have all gone down here. And it's what unites us. It's what brings us together. It's what makes us show up on a Monday night to go into a cellar and down here and have a preface experience. It's what gets you out of bed on a Sunday morning to show up here and attempt to figure out who we are and who you're becoming in all of it. And I call it the awakening spirituality. And it's a journey that we all, or most of us here, are finding ourselves on these days. So 10 years ago, I turned 40. And I remember we were in the throes of a series. And it was something about the Bible or a series on the Bible. I can't remember what it specifically was, but we were attempting to articulate why the Bible was so significant to our spiritual journey here at Watershed. My problem was, at 40, the Bible was losing significance for me. It was not gaining significance. And I was supposed to talk about its significance. And I remember that Sunday morning getting up, and we were over at Actors Theater in Oda, and I started sharing exactly what I just said with you guys, that I was told this text, if I read it a certain way, if I parsed the Greek verbs the correct way, if I could even read the Hebrew, if I would memorize it, it somehow would bring on magical properties. It would fix the pains in my life. It would bring relief to angst. It would be a salve over the confusion and complexity and pains of my reality. And here I was at 40, and I'm missing those things. No matter how I read it, no matter how I engaged, no matter how I imbibed it. I remember standing up that Sunday, and as only Watershed does, because you're such a gracious community, and you allow your leadership to make the same kind of shifts that you all have, and you let in all of it, what I was going through in my own experience was I was having, I think, a profound disruption. And that's what begins to happen for most of us when we begin this awakening spirituality. The first part of that whole journey is we have a pain or disruption that causes us to question. I remember I had this disruption. I'm thinking, I think I'm seeing life differently. I think I'm seeing the world a little bit through a different lens, and it's not easy to sit with, especially this is the gig I get paid to do, and I got to tell people supposedly how to live out their lives through this venue of, in that context, we were in a series on the Bible, and it wasn't working for me that way. And so I remember the disruption. I remember the angst of it and the destabilizing nature of what that moment was meaning to me. And yet you guys allowed me to sort of sit with it and to wrestle with it. And again, I'd found like the second stage of this whole process for me was also this, that I recognized that my world was not necessarily being propped up by me checking all the right spiritual boxes. Because what I had assumed was that, if I do all the right things, that somehow things are going to work out in my favor spiritually. If I, show up to services enough time, if I volunteer enough, if I write big enough checks, then somehow God's going to meet my needs. And we recognize that our worldview, our grid does not fix the plight that we've been told. And what began to happen is I realized I still was navigating pain and hurt like anybody else. And it was regardless of how many boxes I checked. And what began to, play out for me is the destabilizing of my spiritual journey began to happen full on. And this is, what I'm talking about is mostly your stories here. I had a gentleman after the service, older gentleman, came up and just put his arms around me and wept because he said, yes, that's my story. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do with all these years of all this stuff, and now I've got something that's kind of all breaking down for me. And he began to sort of articulate what happens in this third stage where you begin dismantling the bricks of your faith. You start pulling them out. You start throwing them all away. I mean, you begin to realize that maybe the Bible might have gotten it wrong regarding sexual orientation, Or maybe the virgin birth didn't happen, or maybe it did, and I don't know. What does that mean, and how much should that inform how I see faith or God or Christ? Did miracles actually take place? You begin asking these questions, and you start wondering if all of those things are true, and you start pulling those bricks out, and the whole thing starts to begin to topple over. And here's what's interesting. This was something I had no idea would happen for me. As I was pulling these bricks out in my faith, in that sense, our staff, we've had to navigate this over the years, and it was not easy. But again, this was the kind of community that allowed us that journey, allowed us that process, because it was your journey. But what happens is when you come from a place of faith, at least the faith background that I came, everything was trumped by the narrative of God. That your whole world was, that if there was a food chain of what things mattered in life to you, the conversation, your spirituality, your connection with Christ, your connection with God was at the absolute top. And if that narrative began to crumble ever so gently, what began to happen is other things also started to unravel. Political worldviews, sexual orientation conversations, and how one sees that playing out in reality. How you understand marriage, how you understand parenting, it all begins to change. I used to vote party line because I thought that was what we were supposed to do. I began to realize, wait a minute. Both parties, or the third party, or however many parties there are out there that are legit, are sort of, none of them have all the answers. So is it possible that one party might address one issue really well, another party might address another issue really well? So I might find myself voting all over the place because that seems to make more sense. But that was not a worldview I had prior to my spiritual journey beginning to sort of unravel. That actually I begin asking questions now about how I vote. I'm going to maybe vote in that way, and it might actually hurt me personally. It might cost me more in my own purse strings and in my own family's financial well-being, but that might be the way Jesus would want me to vote. You begin to ask different questions in that sense. Here, I'm not telling you how to vote, for the record. I'm just telling you this is how this plays out. And so you begin to dismantle this dismantling. It moves, and it's kind of like this fourth stage. It moves into other areas of your life. That other ways in which you see reality begin to unravel. This is a roadmap that arguably is many of your reality. I've had coffees with you. I've had you in my home. I've heard you talk about this, and you do so with this sense of fear and anxiety for all the right reasons, because the grid with which you've held to is being taken out from underneath you. That you have nothing else really to fall back onto. And so what you do is, you do like a lot of us would have this existential crisis. You let most of, if not all, your past spiritual narrative go. And this happens really quickly all of a sudden. This might be a couple of years initially, but all of a sudden it happens at a really quick pace because you begin asking hard questions and you begin to realize the systems that you've held to are deeply flawed. They're deeply imperfect, and that's okay. But it's not easy to say that was okay earlier on. It's okay now, but I've had to go through a lot of pain. I've had a lot of things go up to that point. And then what ultimately happens is this sort of futile place of you try and replace it with something new. So most of us here today are probably not living at stage 6 because you're here. You've not wiped out, you've not thrown out the baby with the bathwater fully because you're here. But a lot of folks have come through watershed, and it's at stage 6. They let much of their past narrative go. It's what everybody does that deconstructs. I've done yoga for 6 years, and I like the woods. And so what ends up happening is you have all of this experience, for many of us, decades of experience in the church, with all her imperfections, with all this experience, and in a matter of months or a couple of years, we let it all go, and then we try to jump into something completely new. And you find yourself saying, I mean, as meaningful as yoga might be, as meaningful as contemplative spaces and reflection and being outside in the world, as meaningful as all that is, and it is, it's such a new thing. You're so uninformed, and you don't really know what's going on, and you're in this place of, oh, I'm just lost. I had so many friends that have been in this journey, that have been in this place where they just throw the baby out of the bathwater. They want nothing to do with any of it anymore. And I'm here to say, is it possible, if I could kind of go back into stage 5 and crowbar something into that space, if I could take us back there, and instead of letting much of your spiritual narrative go, if I could introduce something else there that would potentially change the trajectory of how you see your spiritual reality, I want to do that today. Because for a lot of years, I've spoken from this space of the church has haunted us, it's screwed us over, it's hurt us. And for some, that's very, very true. And I don't want to lessen that. Yet, I'm here to say, is it possible there are some variances related to the church that are actually quite significant and meaningful? Is it possible that there is a new way for us to reclaim how we if I, for 1 second, pause and allow the free fall just for a moment to cease, where I'm pulling all the bricks out, narrative, I can look back on some friendships, some of the richest and the closest friendships I have to this day were founded in the church. One of my closest buddies, his name was Jamie. We were 10 years old in 5th grade together, and we were in a youth group together in a church, and we lived around the corner from me, and we ended up going to the same middle school and high school. We were college roommates. He planted a church the year after Watershed planted a church. Like, we've been on the same trajectory, and this all came from a close-knit community called the church. I think as a child, I know that there was a lot of legalism around my childhood and my upbringing, and a good dose of guilt. I mean, after all, we're good at that in the church, right? But also, I had some good boundaries. I had some people that were setting very definitive boundaries. Some arguably maybe too extreme, too strict, but nonetheless, I had guidelines that sort of coached me into adulthood. What I also learned in the church, it wasn't just about me. That the way in which the world operates is again, very myopic, very self-centered, but I was invited into a narrative that Jesus invited us into, where you are to look outside of your own wants and needs at times. You are to love, you're to turn the other cheek. Some of these things that would not have been a part of my reality. The idea of connecting to God and a relationship with God, that was a narrative that the church offered me. The divine, and what's that mean to engage that? So if I could get some of you to pump the brakes, if I get you to say, all right, maybe there is something here worth considering. Maybe there is something worth reclaiming. It's going to be one of these key words you're going to hear us use in the years ahead. This idea of taking what we've invested in, what we've experienced, and why would we just walk away from all of it? Some of it is worthy of walking away from. But for 1 second, if you just stop and you think about it, think about your parenting, if you're a parent. I've been a parent now for about 15 and a half years. My wife and I have 2 sons. And every year, it's a different experience. For all the reasons you also know, right? I mean, every year you're navigating nuances with age and culture and all the things that are different in parenting. And in bricks, you're pulling bricks out, and you're letting whole new ways of reality sort of set in as you shift your understanding of parenting. Does that mean I cease parenting? No. But for many of us, we've taken our spiritual journey, and we pull the bricks out and we say, well, I cease all of it. I'm just going to do yoga and go to the woods. I'm here to say maybe there's more we can grab. I'm married 19 years, and my wife and I see life and reality and each other very differently than we do today. And there have been multiple changes and shifts. We talked about that in our series a couple weeks ago, and how we see relationships and marriage. But are we walking away from that? Maybe 1 or 2 I've wanted to walk away, if I can be honest. It's really good work, but it's hard. It's really good work, though. But I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. And we've had tons of shifts here. Are we walking away from it? No. Is it possible that what we do in our marriages, what we do in our parenting, what we do in our jobs, our careers, is we are in a constant space of reclaiming, retweaking, editing, rebuilding? What if we begin to play the same thing with our faith journey, with our spirituality? What if we begin to reclaim it in ways that we might re-edit and re-see it and review it? So when it comes to music, for example, for years we would, God, I love him enough in enough statements and phrases. If I don't let him know I worship him or her enough, then maybe they're not going to be as pleased with me. And therefore, I'm not going to be able to check all the boxes and have all the benefits of the blessings that are God. Right? Like, it's all these connections that sometimes we make intentionally and sometimes we don't make intentionally. Now we say, well, what does it mean if as a community we can proclaim statements and truths about God, about each other, and we get to sing it out, and in a space together, that begins to change us and inform us. It begins to mark you. It begins to impact how you see reality and how we see each other. That would be a way to reclaim maybe the worship experience, for lack of a better term, of what we've been working on for years. But often, Karen and Austin, they'll change the words because the words are not reflective of maybe a reclaimed passage. Or is probably the one that is the easiest to do, and it's the part that when we walk away from the spiritual narrative here, it's the thing that is the hardest to let go initially, but once that goes, then everything begins to unravel. But what if instead of throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying, you know what, the Bible is just an ancient text that is so dated, it's not worth pursuing, but actually, what if it is profoundly relevant, but we look at it through a reclaimed lens? So like, for example, John 14. Many of you probably heard this passage growing up in Sunday school or in some kind of church setting. In my Father's house, Jesus is making these statements. My Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go and prepare a place for you. So the assumption when I read this passage in the 21st century, and this is what I was literally taught and how to interpret this passage, is that this was a part of my evacuation plan. This was a part of when I die, I go to heaven and I literally have a mansion in heaven. That literally was the narrative I was taught. Many churches in religious institutions across America this morning are teaching that way. You know what? And that's fine. However they want to do it. I think there's a more reclaimed, more beautiful way of looking at it. But the narrative that I was taught was that heaven's this huge place, and God is somewhere on Main Street, and you want to get as close as you can to Main Street. He's going to have the biggest mansion, of course. And then based on the kinds of works that you do and the boxes that you check over your lifetime, your mansion will be a certain size. And so if you do really nice things and you're Mother Teresa, you got a really big mansion, right? If you're an axe murderer, you might have a doghouse. If you make it, right? That's a whole other conversation. So like you have all, so that's the grid with which we see those kinds of places. But you got to understand first century culture. First century Judaism, place is everything. Proximity is everything. So if I can take you back to the Old Testament, you remember the Israelites were roaming in the desert for 40 years? I mean, called the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant held God's presence. I guess God would be contained to a box somehow. They'd walk around with this box. And when they would set up their tents, their camp, they would set up a large tent that was sort of the portable temple. And in there would be tiers and layers to different rooms that different people had different access to based on your status, based on if you were a chief priest or less than chief priest or whatever it was. And then there was this Holy of Holies space in which the box would reside. And that's where God's presence would be. And we jump ahead a few centuries, and you have this king by the name of Solomon in the scriptures who then, because they're no longer nomadic, he builds this temple in Jerusalem, this huge, beautiful edifice that is finely illustrative of the divine and where the divine should be. And this temple's massive. It's got courtyards, it's got places for people to socialize and people to sell and buy things. It's got places for you to have worship, to wash your hands. Only different people have access to, but proximity is everything. Because the closer you can be to God, it matters. It's significant. It's a part of the Jewish understanding. It's a part of the Jewish narrative. And so when Jesus says, I'm going to prepare an Americana narrative, as a matter of fact, we're nothing like that. We're all about, let's go west, let's get out of here, let's move, and constantly being on the move. It's a complete different grid in which you and I understand the world. But if we can look at it from a reclaimed standpoint, just a few books in the Bible later, the Apostle Paul writes in Corinthians, and he completely changes up the grid that even Jesus was communicating. And he says, by the way, the temple is not a place. It's what? You, right? In that the Holy of Holies is not a place in the temple that you go to, that the Spirit resides in you, right? That you actually have the presence of God that is you, is in you. And all of a sudden now, the reclamation of this passage is deeply profound. That is not about a future reality. It's actually about a present now. And that we are invited into that kind of understanding. That our bodies are temples. That you don't have to be Jewish to have this body be a temple. You don't have to be a chief priest. You don't have to be white. You don't have to be whatever it might be. Mind-blowing awareness in the first century. But instead of focusing on the future heaven experience, which we're missing out on the present now. And this is what Paul is inviting us into. This is what a reclaimed way of looking at the scriptures is inviting us into. Because in this reclaimed way, Jesus is honored. The Bible's honored. Our tradition is honored. That it's actually reclaiming something of consequence, that we're honored in that process. Because you begin to look at things differently. What if I can reclaim miracles? What's that mean? I don't know. But is it possible that the healings that Jesus experienced were those real? Are those worth reclaiming and talking about? I don't see anybody walking on water lately, but I don't know what that even begins to look like, reclaiming something like that, right? But under this sort of different definition to say, wait, there's something out there that we've historically just said throw it all out. And now we're saying, no, maybe there's actually something of consequence, that maybe the decades with which you've given your life and your heart and your soul is worth re-engaging, that it's okay if you don't throw it all out. It is okay to get rid of some of it, because some of it is truly toxic. Some of it is truly devastating and is painful. Some of it is not helpful. But if we can re-edit, if we can reclaim it. So let me give you a synopsis of what I just said in about 4 or 5 sentences. And this is a working paragraph that our staff, our elders, we worked really intently on in trying to help understand, so that we have a working definition of what I mean by of God. Right? That's what we do. We're trying to figure out metaphor and imagery with how do we connect to the divine. What does he or she even begin to look like? It describes our valuing the words of those who came before us, taking seriously their encounters and wrestlings with the reality we name as God. But it acknowledges the boundedness of their experiences, separated from our own by the distances of time and place. In other words, of course, their context and our context are very different, right? I mean, we have technology, we have cell phones, we have medicine in ways they didn't have it. We have human developmental understanding, psychology and psychiatry. We have so many, we understand disease and sickness in ways that they never would have understood it. And so we take their context and we bring it forward. More specifically, I'm going to back up here, but it acknowledged the boundedness of their experiences, separated from our own by the distances of time and place. More specifically, the same Jesus who informed the existence of the early church, necessitating that they understand God through the lens of the cross, still speaks to us today in ways and means appropriate to and intelligible in our context. And so reclaiming names the process of translation, engaging in a critically appreciative dialogue with those who came before us, not so we can repeat what they said, this is really important, but so that we can speak of God in fresh expressions, appropriate for our time and for our place, ever informed but never bound by those who spoke first. We're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. That the traditions and the generations before us, they have plenty that they got wrong, absolutely. but some of it might still be worth pursuing. Some of it might still be worth engaging. So a couple thousand years ago, there's a bunch of guys sitting around a dinner table. And it was Jesus and his 12 disciples. And they were about to have what we now call the Last Supper, Eucharist, communion, whatever you want to call it. And Jesus was saying to them, here's the deal, guys. What we've done for 3 years together is of consequence. It's significant. Lives are being changed. Marginalized people are waking up to their marginalization, and oppressive people are waking up to their oppressing. People are getting saved because they're waking up to these things. That would be language that would be illustrative of the first century. We've done a lot of good work together, and Jesus knows that he's on the cusp of being taken away and ultimately killed in the day ahead. And he says to them, and this would be appropriate if you knew this was going to happen, he says to them, hey, when you have this bread and you drink this wine, would you remember me? Would you remember? Would you join me in that? And so do we think for 1 second Jesus or the disciples thought that we would somehow canonize that as a church tradition? Of course not. Of course not. But I argue it's a really good tradition. We've reclaimed it over 2,000 years. We've used it and allowed it to be something that roots us back into the narrative and the message of Jesus. It's worth being reclaimed. It's worth being engaged. And we do it different ways, right? It doesn't matter whatever ilk of church you come from or religiosity you come from, you might do it differently. And you might find that only a certain religious leader can be the one who offers this tradition. Maybe you come from a background like myself that says, well, only if you believe a certain way can you actually participate. Maybe you come from a tradition that says if you get divorced, you can no longer have access to this thing called the Eucharist. Whatever those are, I think that's all tragic and horrific and wreaks havoc on us. But here we get to reclaim it. And we get to, once in a while, like we'll do before Easter, we have a big old meal. Tables full of, other times we do it differently. We have it set up different ways. We have sometimes students who help facilitate it. We have different leaders and volunteers help facilitate it. Men, women, gay, straight, it doesn't matter. Because we've reclaimed it here. So in just a few moments, as we have a couple of the hosts who will be coming forward that will be offering the communion here in just a minute, I'm going to invite you to come on up and take communion. I'm going to pray. And maybe when you take communion today, maybe when you engage it, you look at it from a reclaimed space that is rooted in 2,000 years of church history and tradition. Some of it's really good. Some of it's worth hanging on to. And it's the story of Jesus. It says, hey, if you think about it, guys, next time you do this, will you remember me? But this morning when you do this, we're remembering the way of Jesus. The man that we hold to with such great integrity and love, and a way in which he modeled a way of being that is complex and beautiful and elegant and worth modeling. So I'm going to pray in just a moment. Then I'm going to have you feel free to come on up, and we've got a couple of you that are going to be organizing the communion on either side. And you can come up the middle section. If you want to go back on the sides, that'd probably make it a little bit easier. So let's pray. Father, I want to thank you. Thank you for something so elegant as connection with you and that pursuit of connection with you. It's us to reconcile narrative and metaphor and imagery and literalism in ways that, I guess, just help us continue to wake up. And often it happens in pain. It happens in the context of difficulty. And we also want to do it when we love each other really well. So I love my Watershed family. I love the men and women in this space. I'm grateful for what we get to experience here this morning together as we reclaim our connection with you, God. We pray this all in Christ's name. Amen.
sadness, anxious madness, weakness, secrets, your loneliness. Hallelujah, sing this unhidden melody. Hallelujah, sing in our souls residing. Hallelujah, sing your life, what joy it brings. Hallelujah, sing. And hallelujah, sing. Come find shelter, breathe and rest here. Comfort and peace from burdens you. Hallelujah, sing a song of peace to me. Hallelujah, sing this unhidden melody. Hallelujah, sing in our souls residing. Hallelujah, sing your life, what joy it brings. Hallelujah, sing. And hallelujah, sing. Take this breath, drink this cup with me. 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 Take this breath, take this breath, drink this cup with me. Hallelujah, sing. Hallelujah.
Would you stand as we close this morning? Come out of sadness from wherever you've been. Come broken heart, let her rescue begin. Come find your mercy, for sinner come near. Earth has no sorrow, but heaven can heal. Earth has no sorrow, but heaven can heal. So lay down your burden, lay down your shame. All who are broken, lift up your face. Oh, wanderer, come home. You're not too far. rejoice. Earth has no sorrow, heaven can lay down your lay down your lift up your faith. You're not too far. Lay down your Earth has no sorrow, heaven can heal. 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 Lay down your come as you are. Oh, come as you are. Come as you are. God, this morning as we have come together in this ancient tradition and have connected with each other, connected with these Christian roots. God, our prayer is that this moment would signify something for us, that it would be something that we can use to remind us, as Jesus even instructed, that there would be a remembrance of Him, remembrance of the way. And God, we pray that we would be changed, that the things that we can reclaim and take with us into our week would change us, would change the people around us, the way we interact with others, that we would be able to once again have hope, that we'd be able to bring things with us from our past that would give us hope for the future. So God, I thank you for this morning and the moments of being able to slow down, take deep breaths, and be present. Pray that this week we have those opportunities as well. God, we love you. We thank you. We love each other, and we pray all this in your name. Amen. Thank you so much for being here today. If you're new, we'd love to meet you in the back underneath the last call sign. Have a great Sunday. We'll see you next week.